back to the WSBC podcast. My name is Daniel Lewis. I'm the worship leader at Wakulla Springs Baptist Church, and we're joined by our pastor, Dr. Randy Creel. Sunday's message was from Esther 3 and talked about how life isn't always fair. You want to go ahead and give us a recap of the message?
Sure. We picked up on the last part of chapter 2 and went through chapter 3. And the story of Esther is beginning to unfold. The plot is beginning to thicken. And we're seeing some of those tensions come to bear, where Mordecai, he discovers a plot on the king's life. There are the king's bodyguards that intend to assassinate the king. So he reveals that to Esther, who reveals that to the king. King's life is saved. Mordecai is written in the history books, but no reward is given to Mordecai. And by the way, as you read this story, there's some insignificant facts that take place that actually turn out to be very significant. So that is going to turn out to be a pivotal part of this story, the fact that the king just overlooked and didn't reward him.
Sure.
So then Haman is promoted. Mordecai is not. Now, you don't know it from reading the book of Esther in the verses like chapter 2, verse 23 to chapter 3, verse 1. But later in chapter 3, we find out that actually these events are several years later. So Mordecai is not rewarded, but Haman is promoted. But there's a space of a few years between that. But the writer deliberately puts them up together so you can see the tension and the fact that it's not fair.
Sure.
Mordecai should have been rewarded. Haman was a wicked, evil man. He should not have been put in a position of authority, but yet he was. And Mordecai, though, refuses to bow down to him. King commands, hey, this guy promoted him. He's now prime minister, so to speak, and everybody's going to bow down to him. And Mordecai just refused to do it. And we're not told why he refused to do it. The only clue we have is that it had something to do with the fact that he was a Jew. And so that ticks Haman off. He determines to kill all the Jews, gets the king to sign off on it, and that's really where we end in chapter 3.
So yeah, this story, Mordecai chose to take a stand when refusing to bow down to Haman. Obviously, there was tension there anyway. But could Mordecai have bowed without meaning it and avoided this whole ordeal?
Well, he could have, but there's a biblical term for that. It's called hypocrisy. So when you do things that you don't mean, that's the essence of hypocrisy. The word hypocrisy means to wear a mask. It's from the ancient theater, the Greek theater, where they put a mask on, they would play a role, play a part. Mordecai's a man with convictions. Again, we're not told specifically why he wouldn't bow down to Haman. There's some theories. There's some clues, I think, but the bottom line is he didn't because he's Jewish, and that's why Haman decides, well, I want to kill all the Jews. And so that tension is there. So whatever it is about his faith, about his covenant relationship with God, whatever he was being asked to do was not the norm of just paying respect to a leader or whatever. That was done by the Jews.
Sure, okay.
So it had to go far beyond that, whatever was being asked of them. And he drew a line in the sand. I'm not going to do it. So we can ask that question in a number of other ways, like, couldn't Daniel have prayed in secret instead of opening the windows as he normally did? Well, he could have, but the point was, why would he compromise his faith because of this law that had been given? And I think as believers, let's be honest, we've compromised way too much. We've gone along to get along in areas where we shouldn't have. And Mordecai, again, was a man of conviction, and he just said no. And there comes a time where you have to say, no, that's too far. That crosses the line.
The bowing that we see, we're to assume that it is beyond just paying a respect to Haman.
Well, it had to be, because Jewish people did that. I mean, we have it recorded in the Bible they did that. We also have it recorded in history that they did that. So we're commanded to show respect to government authorities. So it had to be something more than that. One commentator I read said the two words that are used there, they're only used together in the Old Testament with reference to God. And other commentators didn't pick up on that, so I didn't chase that through to see if that's true or not. The two Hebrew words, I mean. Others speculate that it wasn't necessarily the bowing. It was Haman. He's specifically said to be an Agagite, and so that goes back potentially anyway to the ancient enemies of Israel. The Agag was a king, and his people in Israel were bitter enemies. And so if this guy actually is a descendant from way back then Haman is refusing to bow down to one of the arch enemies of Israel. He's like, I'm not going to show respect to that person, because it's debatable. It's also possible that Agag was a province in Persia and he came from there. So we really don't know the exact reason, but we do know it had something to do with the fact that he was a Jew. It wasn't just he's being a jerk. It's not that because later Mordecai is going to be promoted and he's going to work directly for the king. So he's going to show respect to the king, or the king would off with his head. So right. It's something that we're not told specifically, but it had to do with the fact that he was Jewish, and he just couldn't pretend. Yeah, he had to stand.
So now we've seen Esther and Mordecai both in bad situations, and they both had different approaches that we could learn from. So how do we discern between those approaches? How do we discern for ourselves whether to take a stand like Mordecai or to make good of the bad situation like Esther had?
Well, I don't think those two are opposed to each other.
Sure.
There are times when...
Could both be done.
Sure, when we make the best of a bad situation. In fact, Mordecai was encouraging Esther to do that, basically, when he said, don't reveal your identity. He's encouraging her not to make trouble unnecessarily. So how do I know the difference? Well, there are times when things happen to us that we can't change. What do? We got to make the best of it. That's making the best of a bad situation. Esther's kidnapped, basically forced into a bad situation. Mordecai can't do anything to change it. She can't do anything to change it. What are you going to do in that? You got to make the best of it that you possibly can. When Judah, the nation of Judah, the southern two tribes of Israel, were taken into captivity by the Babylonians, God told them through, I believe it's through the prophet Jeremiah, look, you're going to be there 70 years. I want you to settle down. I want you to raise families. I want you to plant gardens and vineyards. I want you to seek the good of the city that you're in. So they're in a bad situation. They're taken away into captivity, but God said, you got to make the best of it. But anything that compromises your faith, we can't make the best of that. We have to take a stand. So we want to be careful that we're not just calling attention to ourselves and I'm going to take a stand over issues that really don't matter one way or the other. But we also need to be careful that we don't become compromisers and just go along to get along. There's a time for God's people to say, look, this crosses the line. It would be sinful for me to do that. Or it might be, it would cause me to go against my conscience to do that. And I'm not going to do it no matter what. I will not compromise. So rephrase the question again. Couldn't the Roman Christians have just gone and burned incense to Caesar and not meant it? Mm-hmm. Well, they could have, but that would have been a compromising of their faith, because in doing so, they had to say, Caesar is Lord. It would have saved them a lot of trouble, but yet it would have compromised their belief in Jesus Christ as Lord. So, yes, there are times we have to make the best of bad situations. Things happen to us we can't change. But there are also times we have to take a stand. Yeah. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. We're not bowing down. Mordecai, I'm not bowing down. Whatever happens, it's not an option. I think if more of God's people did that, our commitment and testimony for Christ would be clear and unmistakable. And that's what we want.
So the reaction to this, Haman was angered by Mordecai. The scripture said he was filled with wrath. So you made the distinction on Sunday that getting angry by itself isn't a sin. We saw Jesus get angry. But in this case, it obviously was by the reaction. So how do we know when our anger is justified versus when it's sinful?
Well, I'll tell you, it's my experience that most of the time our anger is sinful. But it's not always. So I think the question would be, why are you angry?
Right.
What's the cause? There is such a thing as righteous anger, righteous indignation, where there's a zeal that I have for God and His holiness and His name, that when I see things happening that slander or blaspheme the name of God, I'm angry about that. So it's not an anger like I was personally slighted kind of anger. It's an anger on behalf of. If all anger was a sin, God is said to get angry, then God would sin. But His anger is a pure, perfect, righteous, holy indignation. So I think you're going to explore, why am I angry? And sometimes it's justified. Hey, I was wronged, I was harmed. And then in those cases where the anger is justified, okay, what do I do with it? So if I hold on to it, the length of the anger can become sinful. I believe it's the book of Ephesians. Let not the sun go down on your wrath. I may have the wrong book there, but I think it's in the book of Ephesians. So that's giving a time limit. So even if I have a justified reason for being angry, I'm not to hold on to it. I got to deal with it. If I need to deal with it with a person, okay, I need to go deal with it with a person. If I need to deal with it just with my own heart before the Lord, that's what I need to do. But we tend to hold on to anger. Number one, we get angry for the wrong reasons sometimes, and then we tend to hold on to it for decades.
Yeah.
I mean, for decades, right. For longer than you've been alive. I've met people and counseled people that were mad about something that happened longer than your lifespan to this point.
Yeah.
That's not good. That's like, as somebody said, that's like you're mad at somebody, you're wanting to get them, you hold on to it for all these years. It's like drinking poison and hoping the other person dies.
Yeah.
And it doesn't work that way.
I think we have some anger loopholes. I know I do. If in the morning I get up and my dog's whining for food and I'm not ready to give it to her yet, I'll just say I'm getting annoyed with her. No, that's not anger. I'm just annoyed, or little things like that. But two clarifications I do want to ask about, because you brought up the not going to sleep on our wrath, and also the slow to anger.
Mm-hmm.
How literal are these things? Is it saying that we should not be willing to go to sleep that night until we have dealt with our anger? Or is that more of a metaphor for deal with this?
I think I would take it more literally. Look, you need to deal with this before the day's done. You need to work this out in your heart. The issue is sometimes I'll do that, and then the next day comes back to my mind and I get angry again about it. So then I got to kick it in again. First of all, you mentioned being slow to anger. But then just not letting, and that's a struggle. Especially when we're angry about things that are justified.
Sure.
Like maybe somebody intentionally did something to harm us or to harm our reputation, or someone in our family or someone that we love. There's a justified aspect of that anger. It's just that it'll eat you up. So you got to deal with it. Now, if 2 minutes before sundown somebody did something to you, have you got 2 minutes to deal with it before you've sinned? No, I don't think so. I think it's just, look, don't let this linger. Deal with it in that day. Just take care of it. I think you'll find that's harder to do than you would imagine.
So if you are running into something that is justifiable anger, what does it mean to be slow to anger in that moment?
I think in that moment, if it's justifiable anger, I'm not going to have a quick trigger, a light trigger. Grew up shooting firearms. There are rifles that have a light trigger pull. So in other words, you barely touch that trigger and boom, the gun goes off. There are others that have a hard trigger pull. You really got to, you don't have to pull it that hard, but you really have to intentionally work to pull that trigger. And so you want to balance between the two with a firearm, because you don't want to pull the trigger so hard that you mess up your aim, but you also don't want to have it go off before you're ready, just barely touching the trigger. So I think slow to anger, I think we need to have a heavier pull on our trigger for anger.
Sure.
And to be honest, Daniel, let's be honest, most of the things that we get angry about are not a righteous, justifiable type anger.
Often they're the smallest.
They are. And sometimes they're the end of the line. Like, there's been a lot of stuff that's happened, and then that one thing that wasn't so big is the final. And I think we all deal with this. I think we all have to wrestle with it.
Yeah.
Some people more than others. But ultimately, we got to let it go to God, because vengeance belongs to the Lord. Even if there's something justifiable, at some point we have to come to grips with, okay, I have to give this to God. That doesn't mean that we can't pursue in a court like criminal charges or, file charges against someone that has done us wrong. And I think, here's an example of justifiable anger. We were riding our bikes over the weekend. And we ride them in our neighborhood all the time. And we turned a corner, and a big dog came charging across a yard. Right at my wife. He was coming low, hard, barking, growling, vicious. And this was a thick, like Rottweiler type dog. And she was just a few yards ahead of me, so I started yelling at the dog, got off my bike, tried to get myself between the dog and her. A truck pulled up at a stop sign right at that time. We were able to go on the other side of that truck. That kind of distracted the dog, and he went on. I was mad. There's no excuse for that. I went home. I got a baseball bat. So I'm going to ride the rest of this bike ride with a baseball bat over my handlebars. I said, we have to go back. My wife was like, don't go back there. I said, I'm not trying to be there. If that dog gets a kid, he'll kill him. And so I went back, and the dog stayed away from us then. A neighbor came out, called animal control. I hope they took the dog away. We were still riding in the neighborhood. We saw them exit the neighborhood, but couldn't flag them down to see what had happened. And again, maybe the dog just got out of the backyard of somebody. I don't know. But yeah. I was angry. And I think justifiably so. This is a threat that shouldn't be present. But I don't need to be angry about that today. Or it'll eat me up and alive. Got to take precautions on something like that, and then you got to let it go. So we went walking last night in our neighborhood. I took my baseball bat because it's the only way I could defend myself or my wife if that happens again. So again, yeah, we spent a lot of time on this one, but I think it's something people struggle with.
Yeah.
At some point, you got to release it to God, or it will literally eat you up like a burning fire from the inside.
Yeah. Or you'll do what this guy did. Haman's solution to Mordecai's insurrection wasn't to just deal with Mordecai, but to kill all the Jews. It's a pretty rash decision to make in anger. Now, the persecution of the Jews is a constant theme throughout history. We've seen it a lot. Is there a biblical explanation for this?
I don't know of one place in the Bible that you would say, well, this verse tells us, well, the Jews are persecuted because.
Sure.
But big picture, I think there are reasons. I think that, number one, God chose Abraham and his descendants to be his people. He made a covenant with them. It was God's choice. It wasn't based on what Abraham did or didn't do. He chose Abraham, called him out of paganism, led him to the land of promise. And because God set his love on Abraham and his people, Satan hates God and seeks to destroy anything that God loves. And so I think that is primarily one of the reasons that you see this persecution. I think it's satanic in origin, that there's a persecution against the Jewish people. It's true Old Covenant. It's been true down through history of the New Covenant as well. Secondly, I think there's a motivation to try to thwart the plan and the promise of God. So if Satan could have killed all the Jews, say in Esther, well, there's no Messiah coming because he's coming from the Jewish people. Now that theoretically is possible, but not actually possible because God would never allow that to happen and he's sovereign. But Satan, I mean, he knows that, but yet he still fights and battles and wages war. And I think that's one of the motivations to destroy the plan of God and the purpose of God. And I think even now, if you take the prophecies literally, Christ is going to return, and I do take them literally. When he returns, there will be a Jewish people, a Jewish nation in Israel when he returns. There will be a massive repentance on their part as they look upon the one that they pierced, one of the minor prophets says. So, again, if Satan, through a Hitler or somebody else, could wipe out all of the Jews, well, then those prophecies couldn't happen and be fulfilled. Again, we know from God's sovereignty he would never allow that to happen, but yet Satan fights against and wars against. So I think a short answer is it's satanic in origin. In Revelation chapter 12, when you get to the tribulation period, you see Satan's hatred against Israel and the people of Israel being demonstrated there symbolically through the woman that has the child. Satan tries to devour the child, the male child, which would be Christ, but he can't do that. So he tries to destroy the woman and her descendants. It's a satanic rage. That's why the Jewish people have been persecuted down through the centuries and still are to this day.
Yeah. It's hard to think about. I mean, it just seems so impossible. But
it's reality.
It wasn't even that long ago.
And it's consistent throughout history, so it's not like an accident.
Right.
There's a bigger plan involved. And I think, again, it's satanic in origin.
So at the beginning of your message, we were hit with the fact that life isn't fair. But in the end, you added to the statement that life isn't fair, but God is sovereign. So how should we act when we feel that life has been unfair to us?
If there's anything you can do to change it, then do it. So if something has happened to you and there's something you can do to change it and it's been unfair, then certainly you would do that. When Paul was arrested, he used his rights as a Roman citizen to his benefit. So he was being treated unfairly at times. He was about to be beaten by the Romans to try to figure out what in the world just happened in Jerusalem. Why is the city in an uproar? Mm-hmm. And he said to the guys that were about to beat him, the soldiers, "Are you going to beat an uncondemned Roman?" and they backed off. So he was about to be treated unfairly, and he used his rights as a citizen of Rome to his advantage. So if we can do anything to stop it, we should, but the problem is we just normally can't. So when we can't do anything to stop it or fix it after the fact, we got to trust God.
Yeah.
And we got to keep moving forward and make the best of it. We have to suffer sometimes for the cause of Christ. And that's unfair and unjust, but yet it's reality. We can't sit down and die in it, is what I'm saying, and become bitter about it. We have to put our focus on the Lord.
So focusing on the God's sovereignty end of that statement, how should God's sovereignty affect our perception of the fairness of our life?
I think it gives us hope that this is not all meaningless, that God has a plan and a purpose, that he will use even this somehow that I may not ever understand for his glory and to make me more like Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
So I have to be confident in his sovereignty. That doesn't mean that I don't believe that God has caused that unfairness to happen. Certainly he's allowed it to happen. Some people say, well, there's a fine line between it, but actually God's not the cause of evil, but he has allowed evil to take place. So it's that same distinction. We have to rest in it. I think it gives us, not only does it give us hope for a better day that God's at work, but I think it gives us peace. And we can rest in knowing, look, God has not forgotten me. God has not forgotten me. I've just finished a book. I referenced it on Sunday. It's about a POW chaplain from World War II. He was held as a POW by the Japanese for over 3 years. He was a chaplain. There were other chaplains in this prison camp. And this book has been about him predominantly, but I've been astonished at the ministry that they carried on in that prison camp. I mean, I read stories of men coming to Christ as prisoners of war through terrible suffering, but yet these chaplains were in the midst pointing people to God. And I think they were being treated so unfairly, and I think they're a model and an example of, for some reason, God has allowed us to be here in the middle of this mess. What are we going to do? We're going to do what God's called us to do for as long as we possibly can. And some of them survived and some of them died. I mean, but they divided it up. Okay, you're going to be working the barracks. You're going to be working the hospitals. You're at Ward 0, they called it, which meant if you went there, you had zero chance to survive. They called it the pearly gates because you weren't coming back. These men made the best of it. They trusted in God. They could have turned away from their faith. But instead they said, okay, I'm here. I'm a follower of Christ. I'm going to share the gospel with these other men. Even had a chance a couple of times to share it with the new commandant of the camp, Japanese guy that was running the place. They switched him. This guy had been raised by missionaries in Japan. He was not a believer, but he did understand at least what it was about. Had conversations with that guy about Jesus Christ. So it was a mess, but in God's sovereignty, he allowed those men to be in the middle of it, and they stayed true to their mission. That's what we need to do. Don't quit. Don't stand down. Stand up. Share the good news of Christ even in the midst of horrible situations.
I think that's a good point to end on. Thank you guys for listening. If you ever have a question, be sure to send it to us at worship@wsbc.me. Or you can go to our website on the podcast page, scroll down, there's a form there you can fill out, send us a question. But anyway, thanks for listening. Have another good week.